Hello, everybody. Benga here discussing the risky concept of risk management. Risk concepts. Under risk management, looking at corporate strategic management and ethics, CSME is what we are looking at today. Concepts are keywords that whenever we are discussing a risk management, they will definitely feature. So those are what we called risk management concepts, and we are going to be looking at what risk exposure really means. What do we mean when we're talking about dynamics of risk management? What do we mean by risk appetite, and what is risk-based approach to risk management? We need to understand all these concepts. Discuss effectively about risk management as somebody that understands risk management very well and everything that it does entails. So what is risk exposure? Just like when we open our windows, mosquitoes come in, and we will say that we've exposed our rooms, our house, our homes to mosquitoes. Likewise, when we're talking about risk exposure, we are talking about our vulnerability, business vulnerability. So risk exposure is business vulnerability, and business vulnerability must be managed very well. That means we need to understand our business, our businesses, our industries, and its dynamics before we can assess and measure our risk, not to talk about even prioritizing it. We can only prioritize after we've been able to understand, identify, assess, and measure it. So risk exposure is what we are vulnerable to in our business, which may be in form of the inherent risk in our business or may not be the inherent risk. Inherent risk, we cannot avoid it. Is there, is unique with the business. But we can have a risk that can be controlled. We had already gone into much details about the pure risk and speculative risk, and please check the video so that you can understand this better. Let us move on to the dynamics of risk management. The dynamic nature of risk management. The world itself is dynamic. The business world in particular is dynamic. So is risk also. Risk sometimes and in some industries may be a bit of a static in nature. But if at all, it seems dynamic, static rather, at a point it becomes dynamic, if not turbulent. So the dynamic nature of risk assessments entails us understanding our industry, the peculiarity of our business and business environment. The five forces must be understood very well, and must be able to assess, scan through our environment, and take control and take charge of even those seemingly static risks and those ones that are dynamic. But like I said, all becomes dynamic at a point, and we must be able to respond to the dynamic nature of our risk assessment. Basically, at the apex of business, the board of directors, the pioneer of the organization, the founders, must take charge of the risk identification, risk measurement, and prioritizing the responsiveness and control, putting control in place to mitigate, debar, share the risk appetite. In mitigating and controlling our risk exposure, we must be able to determine our risk appetite, and the apex people in charge of governance must dictate the tune concerning the risk appetite of the organization, of the shareholders, of the stakeholders. They must be able to set a risk appetite for the organization. This may sound technical, but maybe qualitative and quantitative setting of risk appetite. To what extent can we tolerate the impact of risk in our business? That is what we are talking about when we say risk appetite. And to what degree can we not tolerate risk exposure in our business? So to the extent that we could not tolerate, to that extent we must take risk management precautionary measures in form of whether we want to share the risk, transfer the risk, accept the risk, minimize the risk. And when we are all these that I've mentioned as risk management tools, how their advantages and their disadvantages. Let us take as an example our business have risk exposure to, let's say, fire. We can take fire insurance. That's a way of managing it, and we'll say that we've transferred the risk to the insurance company, and the insurance company too has the risk for paying us back, and they too can reinsure. That's why we have reinsurance in insurance business. So risk can be transferred, and even the people that are managing risk on our behalf do equally transfer it in form of reinsurance engagement among themselves in the industry. Risk-based approach. When we are talking about risk-based approach, this is a bit on the risk management profession, but I will try to explain it to the degree of that everybody can understand. Risk-based approach, we must talk about a risk universal. When we are talking about a risk universal, we are talking about sitting down to identify painstakingly all risks as much as possible that could come to mind that our organizations are exposed to. We call it risk universal. So we have to document all the risks from each department, each function, each job role, and the like. Every unit in our organization or within an organization must be critically examined and re-examined and assessed for risk identification and measurement of risk impact. So having all this in maybe one document or the other, we call it risk universal. From that risk universal, we begin to prioritize and manage our risk, having identified them and listed them out. And when we do this painstakingly, we say that we are taking a risk-based approach. That is, we understand very well all our risks, or at least to greater extent. We have them documented and we have risk measurements put against each and every one of the identified risks. So we say we are taking a risk-based approach to business governance and management. Greater detail of risk concepts and management we are going to have in the next topic: identification, assessment, and measurement of risk, under which we are going to be talking about risk identification and the impact of risk on stakeholders. We are going to be looking at assessment of risk, the impact of occurrence, and the frequency or probability of occurrence, how to measure our risk, and how to prioritize our risk. We are going to discuss the role of the board in identification and assessment of risk. We are going to learn how to undertake ALARP principle, as low as reasonably practicable principle of risk management. We are going to be discussing the objective and subjective risk perception and related and correlated risk factor will be examined and touched on. Having looked at the concepts in which we spoke about exposure to risk being the vulnerability, the dynamic nature of risk has been looked at, in which we said risk can be static in nature temporarily and ultimately will become dynamic. And whether it's static or becoming dynamic, one thing as professionals and business owners, one thing we need to do is to ensure that we manage our risk very well and scan through our environment and industry. Risk appetite is our tolerance level, and those that we cannot tolerate, the risk that we could not tolerate, we either transfer, we either share, and those that we can tolerate, they become acceptable risk. And a risk-based approach to risk management is a one that we sit down to identify our risk universal and compile it into a risk universal as a document, and using it to control, to manage our risk and to determine the prioritization that we are going to give it by the dynamics that it entails. So we had loved that you subscribe to the channel, click the notification button, like and share the video to others so that they can be beneficiary of the good work. And when you do that, others around you will be reached. Click notification button, ensure you click all so that anytime we push out new videos, which we promise to do oftentimes, you will receive notification immediately. From James Associate channel, Bengal Latinji will be signing off. We are value to life. We are value to your business.